The gunshot echoed through the valley as Pearl Goodwin ran for her life, her bare feet bleeding from the sharp rocks that littered the dusty Montana terrain. The year was 1878, and her world had collapsed in the span of a single night. Her breathing came in ragged gasps as she spotted a weathered barn in the distance, its silhouette a promise of temporary sanctuary against the approaching storm, both the one brewing in the darkening sky and the one pursuing her on horseback. Pearl's life on her father's homestead had been peaceful until 3 days ago when a band of outlaws had arrived demanding protection money. When her father refused, they'd shot him point blank. She'd managed to escape through the kitchen window, but they'd tracked her across the rugged landscape for days. Now, with nothing but the tattered dress on her back, she pushed her exhausted body toward the only shelter visible for miles. The barn door creaked as she slipped inside, the musty scent of hay and livestock enveloping her. Rain began pattering against the roof as she collapsed in an empty stall, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. She couldn't remember when she'd last eaten. Her shoes had disintegrated during her flight, leaving her feet raw and blistered. Tears welled in her eyes as the full weight of her situation crashed upon her. Her father was dead. Her home was gone. And she was alone, hunted, with no idea where to turn. The sob that tore from her throat was primal, the sound of pure desperation. "Miss? You all right there?" The deep voice startled her so badly she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the barn wall. A tall figure stood in the doorway of the stall, silhouetted by the lantern he held. Pearl could make out broad shoulders beneath a duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt me." The man hung the lantern on a hook and slowly crouched down, keeping his distance. In the warm glow of the lamp, she could see his face weathered by sun and wind, with clear green eyes that studied her with concern rather than malice. "I ain't gonna hurt you, miss," he said, his voice gentler than his rugged appearance suggested. "This here's my barn, and you look like you could use some help." Pearl couldn't stop the tears that flowed down her dirt-streaked face. "They're after me," she managed to say between sobs. "They killed my father." The stranger's expression hardened slightly. "Who's after you?" "Randall's gang," she whispered. "We couldn't pay what they demanded." Recognition flashed in his eyes. "Caleb Randall?" She nodded, drawing her knees to her chest. "My name's Griffin Easton," he said, removing his hat and placing it on the stall divider. "I run this ranch. You're safe here, at least for now." Pearl wiped futilely at her tears. Pearl Goodwin." Griffin's eyes traveled down to her bleeding feet, and his jaw tightened. Without another word, he stood, left the stall, and returned moments later with a clean cloth and a bucket of water. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her feet. Too exhausted to protest, Pearl nodded. He knelt before her and gently placed her feet in the cool water. The relief was immediate, and fresh tears these from gratitude spilled down her cheeks. "I'm sorry about your father," Griffin said as he carefully cleaned the dirt and blood from her feet. "Randall's been terrorizing homesteaders all through this valley. Sheriff's too scared to stand against him." "What am I going to do?" Pearl whispered, more to herself than to Griffin. Griffin finished tending to her feet, then reached for his hat. In a gesture that surprised her, he placed it gently on her head. It was far too big, nearly covering her eyes. "Mine now," he said with unexpected gentleness. "You're under my protection, Miss Goodwin, for as long as you need." The absurdity of the moment, her sitting barefoot in a stranger's barn, wearing a cowboy hat that engulfed her head, struck her suddenly, and a strange sound escaped her lips, something between a sob and a laugh. Griffin smiled, and for the first time in days, Pearl felt a flicker of hope. "Let's get you up to the house," he said, offering his hand. "Some food, clean clothes, and a safe place to sleep. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." As the rain pounded against the barn roof, Pearl took his hand and allowed herself to be pulled to her feet. She had no reason to trust this stranger, yet something in his steady gaze told her that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found sanctuary. Griffin's ranch house was modest but well kept, with sturdy furniture and a fire crackling in the stone hearth. Pearl sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket, Griffin's hat still perched on her head. She hadn't had the heart to remove it, this strange token of protection. "It ain't much," Griffin said as he placed a steaming bowl of stew before her. But it's hot. Pearl couldn't remember when food had smelled so wonderful. She ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some semblance of manners. But hunger soon overcame propriety, and she devoured the meal as Griffin busied himself around the kitchen, tactfully giving her privacy. "There's a spare room upstairs," he said when she'd finished. "Used to belong to my ranch hand, Carlos, before he got married and moved to town. There's a wash basin with clean water and some clothes that might fit you belonged to Carlos's sister when she stayed here last summer." "Why are you helping me?" Pearl asked, her voice small in the quiet kitchen. Griffin leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "My ma used to say that you measure a man by what he does when no one's watching," he said. "Wouldn't be right to turn away someone in need." There was something more, Pearl sensed, but she was too exhausted to press. "Thank you," she said simply. That night, clean and dressed in a borrowed nightgown, Pearl lay in a real bed for the first time in days. Griffin's hat sat on the bedside table, its presence oddly comforting. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as her mind replayed the horror of her father's death and her desperate flight. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with pounding hoofbeats and the crack of gunfire. She woke with a start to find early morning sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, but then memories of the previous evening came flooding back. Griffin Easton, the barn, safety at least temporarily. After dressing in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue skirt and white blouse that were slightly too large, but clean and whole, Pearl made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, but a coffee pot bubbled on the stove. She poured herself a cup and ventured outside onto the porch. Griffin stood by the corral, watching as a young man exercised a spirited chestnut horse. The ranch sprawled before her, not the largest she'd seen in the territory, but well-maintained, with a main barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with late spring snow. "Morning," Griffin called when he spotted her. He crossed to the porch, his expression questioning. "Sleep all right?" "As well as could be expected," Pearl replied honestly. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's Tomas," he said, gesturing to the young man with the horse. "He helps around the ranch. Carlos's nephew. The cook, Mrs. Wilkerson, will be here around noon. She comes in 3 times a week." Pearl clutched her coffee cup tighter. "Mr. Easton, I can't impose on your hospitality." "I need to—" "Griffin," he interrupted. "Just Griffin is fine. And you're not imposing. You're welcome to stay until you figure out your next move." His voice softened. "It's not safe for you to leave, not with Randall's men still looking." The reality of her situation hit Pearl anew. "But I can't just. I need to earn my keep." Griffin considered this. "Can you cook?" Pearl nodded. "And so, I kept house for my father after my mother died." "The ranch could use a regular cook," Griffin said. "Mrs. Wilkerson's getting on in years, and she'd probably appreciate cutting back her days. And there's always mending to be done." "You'd pay me? For staying in your home?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Seems fair. You work, you get paid. That's how it generally works." Pearl felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She wouldn't be a charity case, at least. "Thank you," she said. "I accept." Griffin nodded, as if the matter was settled. "I've got to ride out and check the north pasture fence. Tomas will be around if you need anything." As he moved to leave, Pearl remembered something. "Your hat," she said, turning to retrieve it from upstairs. "Keep it," Griffin called over his shoulder. "Told you last night it's yours now." Pearl watched him walk toward the barn, his stride purposeful. There was something about Griffin Easton that both puzzled and intrigued her. Beneath his taciturn exterior, she sensed a deep well of feeling, carefully controlled. He'd offered her safety and work without hesitation, yet she knew almost nothing about him. The next few days established a routine. Pearl took over the kitchen, cooking meals that brought genuine appreciation from Griffin and enthusiastic praise from Tomas. She mended shirts, darned socks, and slowly began to feel useful again. At night, she still woke from nightmares, but they were becoming less frequent. Griffin remained something of an enigma. He worked from dawn until dusk, ate the meals she prepared with compliments that seemed to surprise himself, and occasionally shared stories of ranch life during the evening hours. But he never spoke of his past or how he'd come to own the ranch. It was Tomas who finally shed some light on Griffin's history one afternoon as Pearl helped him groom the horses. "Boss doesn't talk much about himself," the young man said, brushing a bay mare's flank. "But my Uncle Carlos told me some. Mr. Easton fought in the war, the big one between the states. Came west afterward, like a lot of men did. How did he end up with this ranch?" Pearl asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. Tomas hesitated. "There was an old rancher, Mr. Henderson. Had no family. Griffin started working for him. Saved the ranch during a bad winter when wolves were picking off the cattle. Mr. Henderson left him everything when he passed 5 years back." "Griffin seems young to own such a place," Pearl observed. "He's 32, Tomas replied. "Been through more than most men twice his age, Uncle Carlos says." Pearl thought about this as she prepared dinner that evening. At 20, she'd already endured her share of hardship, losing her mother to fever when she was 12, and now her father to violence. Perhaps that's why she felt a connection to this quiet, reserved man who'd taken her in without question. She was setting the table when Griffin entered, hat in hand, a new one he'd purchased in town to replace the one he'd given her. "Something smells good," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Rabbit stew," Pearl replied. Tomas brought back 3 from his traps. Griffin washed at the basin, and Pearl couldn't help noticing the breadth of his shoulders, the strength in his hands. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, his face too weathered, his features too strong, but there was something compelling about him. "Town's buzzing with news," Griffin said as they sat down to eat. "Randall's gang robbed the bank in Silverdale yesterday. Shot the manager." Pearl's spoon clattered against her bowl. "Were they? Did anyone mention looking for me?" Griffin's eyes met hers across the table. "No specific mention, but word is they're still in the area. I'm sorry, Pearl. I know you're anxious to move on, but it might be best if you stay put a while longer." The concern in his voice warmed something inside her. "I don't mind staying," she admitted softly. "I feel safe here." Something flickered in Griffin's eyes, but he quickly looked down at his stew. "Good," he said, his voice gruff. "That's good." Later that night, as Pearl stood on the porch watching the stars emerge, she heard Griffin's footsteps behind her. He stopped beside her, a respectable distance between them, his gaze following hers upward. "Never get tired of that sight," he said quietly. Pearl nodded. The vastness of the Montana sky never failed to humble her. "My father used to say that the stars are windows into heaven, where our loved ones can look down on us." Griffin was silent for a long moment. "Nice thought," he finally said. "Do you believe in heaven, Griffin?" The question slipped out before Pearl could consider its propriety. He shifted beside her. "Saw too much in the war to be sure of much of anything," he replied. "But I'd like to think there's something more than this, that it all means something in the end." The sadness in his voice touched her deeply. Impulsively, Pearl reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you've done for me." Griffin looked down at her hand, then up at her face. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding and possibility. Then he gently stepped back, breaking the contact. "It's getting cold," he said. "Should head in." That night, Pearl lay awake thinking about Griffin Easton and the life he'd carved out for himself in this wild country. She thought about his kindness, his quiet strength, and the shadows that sometimes darkened his eyes. And for the first time since her father's death, her thoughts were not consumed by grief and fear. Spring progressed into early summer, and Pearl's place on the ranch solidified. Mrs. Wilkerson happily relinquished most of the cooking duties, coming only once a week to help with larger baking tasks. Pearl found herself humming as she worked, her spirits lifting with each passing day. News of Randall's gang continued to filter in. They'd been spotted to the north, then the east, but seemed to have moved away from the immediate area. Still, Griffin insisted it wasn't safe yet for Pearl to travel, and truth be told, she found herself inventing reasons to stay. One evening in late June, Griffin returned from town with supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said, presenting it to Pearl with an almost shy gesture. Inside was a pair of sturdy leather boots, perfectly sized for her feet. Pearl stared at them in amazement. "I noticed you've been wearing Tomas's sister's old shoes," Griffin explained, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Thought you might need something better for ranch life." Pearl blinked back sudden tears. It was the first gift she'd received since her father's death, and the thoughtfulness of it overwhelmed her. "Thank you," she whispered. "They're perfect." Griffin nodded once, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion. "Well, reckon everyone needs decent boots around here." That weekend brought the first real social event Pearl had experienced at the ranch, a small gathering to celebrate Carlos and his wife Maria's 5th wedding anniversary. Carlos had been Griffin's first hire and remained his most trusted friend, even though he now worked primarily at the smithy in town. The yard was decorated with paper lanterns, and tables were laden with food prepared by Pearl, Mrs. Wilkerson, and Maria's mother. A fiddler and guitarist from town provided music, and despite the small number of guests, the atmosphere was festive. Pearl, wearing her new boots and a dress that Maria had helped her alter from one of Mrs. Wilkerson's daughter's cast-offs, found herself enjoying the celebration more than she'd anticipated. The community had accepted her without question as Griffin's cook, and no one pressed her about her past. As the evening progressed, the musicians struck up a lively tune, and couples began to dance in the cleared area near the barn. Pearl watched from the sidelines, smiling at the obvious affection between Carlos and Maria. "Would you care to dance?" She turned to find Griffin beside her, his expression uncertain. He'd traded his work clothes for a clean shirt and trousers, and his hair was neatly combed. Pearl's heart skipped at the realization that he'd made an effort for the occasion. "I'd like that," she said, placing her hand in his outstretched one. Griffin led her into the circle of dancers, his hands settling respectfully at her waist as they began to move with the music. He was surprisingly graceful for such a big man, guiding her confidently through the steps. "Where did you learn to dance?" Pearl asked, genuinely curious. A half-smile curved his lips. "Had a mother who insisted her son should know how to be a gentleman," he said. "Said a man who can dance will never want for company at socials." She was wise, Pearl replied, enjoying the way they moved together, as if they'd been dancing for years rather than minutes. She was, Griffin agreed, a shadow passing over his features. "Lost her in '67. Fever." "I'm sorry," Pearl said softly. "I lost my mother the same way." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Pearl felt something shift between them, a deepening of understanding, a recognition of shared grief. The music changed to a slower tune, and Griffin hesitated. Pearl waited, holding her breath, until he drew her slightly closer, still entirely proper, but intimate enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. They danced in silence, the stars overhead, and the music wrapping around them like a spell. Pearl was acutely aware of Griffin's hand at her waist, the strength in his shoulders beneath her fingers, the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. When the song ended, Griffin didn't immediately step away. For a heartbeat, they stood together, connected by more than just the dance. "Pearl," he began, his voice low. "Griffin, there you are." Carlos's voice broke the moment. "Come settle an argument about that bull you bought last spring." Griffin's hand lingered at Pearl's waist for a second longer before he released her. "Duty calls," he said with a rueful smile. "Save another dance for me." But the opportunity didn't arise again that evening, as Griffin was pulled into one conversation after another. Pearl found herself surrounded by the women, who were eager to share local news and, she suspected, assess her relationship with the ranch owner. "Griffin seems happier these past weeks," Maria commented as they cleared plates from the tables. "More like the man Carlos first met years ago." "He's a good employer," Pearl said carefully. "Very fair." Maria's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "He's a good man, period," she replied. "Too long alone, my husband says." Pearl felt her cheeks warm. "We're not. It isn't like that." "Not yet, perhaps," Maria said with a wink. "But I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one notices." Pearl changed the subject, but Maria's words stayed with her as the party wound down and guests departed. How did Griffin look at her? And more importantly, how did she feel about him? The answer came to her as she lay in bed that night, replaying their dance in her mind. Somewhere amid the grief and fear and uncertainty of the past weeks, Pearl Goodwin had fallen in love with Griffin Easton. The realization should have terrified her, she who had lost everyone she'd ever loved, but instead, it filled her with a quiet warmth that lulled her into the most peaceful sleep she'd experienced in months. Morning brought a return to routine, but Pearl moved through her tasks with a new awareness. Every interaction with Griffin took on added significance, every casual touch a spark of possibility. If he noticed the change in her, he gave no indication, maintaining his usual respectful demeanor. Days stretched into weeks, and July brought scorching heat and the constant threat of wildfire. Ranch work intensified as Griffin pushed to complete necessary tasks before the worst of the summer set in. Pearl found herself rising before dawn to prepare meals and pack provisions for the men working the far pastures. One particularly hot afternoon, as Pearl hung laundry in the yard, she spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon. Visitors were rare, especially in the heat of the day. She shaded her eyes, watching as the riders drew closer, 3 men on horseback, approaching at a steady pace. Something about their posture set off warning bells in Pearl's mind. She dropped the wet sheet back into the basket and hurried toward the house, where Griffin's rifle hung above the fireplace. Her hand was on the door when Griffin emerged from the barn, Tomas at his side. "Get inside," Griffin called to her, his expression grim. "Lock the door." Pearl hesitated. "Who is it?" "Not sure," Griffin replied, "but best not to take chances." Heart pounding, Pearl retreated into the house, but positioned herself by the window where she could see the yard. Griffin and Tomas stood their ground as the riders approached, their stances casual but alert. The lead rider pulled up first, a tall man with a scraggly beard and cold eyes. Even from a distance, Pearl recognized him with a shock of terror. Luke Mercer, Randall's right-hand man. The man who had shot her father. "Afternoon," the man called, his voice carrying clearly through the open window. "Looking for a woman. Young blonde. Name's Pearl Goodwin. Thought you might have seen her." Griffin crossed his arms. "What business you got with this woman?" Mercer shifted in his saddle. "Family matter. Her uncle's mighty worried about her. Sent us to bring her home." The lie was so blatant that Pearl nearly gasped aloud. She had no uncle, and certainly none who would send Randall's gang to find her. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Griffin replied evenly. "This is private property. I'd appreciate it if you'd move along." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we take a look around? For our peace of mind." "I do mind," Griffin said, his tone hardening. "Like I said, this is private property." One of the other riders leaned forward. "Someone in town said you hired a new cook. Blonde girl." "My cook is Mrs. Wilkerson," Griffin replied without hesitation. "Been with the ranch 15 years. Now, I've got work to do." Mercer's hand drifted toward his holster. "You sure you want to play it this way, mister? We're just looking to reunite a girl with her family." Griffin didn't flinch. "And I'm just looking to get back to my ranch work. Good day, gentlemen." For a tense moment, Pearl thought violence would erupt in the yard. Then Mercer spat in the dust and reined his horse around. "Have it your way," he called over his shoulder. "But we'll be keeping an eye out. Girl can't hide forever." Pearl watched through the window as the 3 riders departed, their figures diminishing into the heat haze. When they were out of sight, Griffin and Tomas hurried toward the house. "They're gone," Griffin announced as he entered, "but they'll be back." "They didn't believe me." "It was Mercer," Pearl said, her voice shaking. "He's the one who killed my father." Griffin's expression darkened. "We need to get you somewhere safer." "They'll search the ranch next time." "Where can I go?" Pearl asked, desperation edging into her voice. "They know what I look like. They know I'm in the area." Griffin paced the room, thinking. Carlos and Maria would take you in, but that's the first place they'd look. "What about the old line cabin?" Tomas suggested. "Up in the north pasture. No one's used it since last winter." Griffin considered this. "It's remote enough. Could work for a few days, until we figure out something more permanent." He turned to Pearl. "Pack whatever you need. Food, clothing. We'll leave at dusk." As Pearl gathered her few possessions, a cold realization settled over her. The peaceful existence she'd begun to take for granted was ending. Once again, she would have to run, to hide. The boots Griffin had given her, now broken in and comfortable, seemed to mock her. How long before she'd be fleeing barefoot again? Twilight brought a welcome drop in temperature as Griffin saddled 2 horses. He'd sent Tomas to town with a message for the sheriff, though none of them held much hope for official intervention. "It's about an hour's ride," Griffin explained as he secured Pearl's bundle behind her saddle. "The cabin's basic but sound. There's a spring nearby for water." Pearl nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. "How long will I need to stay there?" Griffin's eyes met hers. I don't know, he admitted. But I won't leave you there alone. I'll stay until we sort this out. Something in his tone made Pearl's heart beat faster. Your ranch, Tomas can manage for a few days, Griffin interrupted. Carlos will help. He adjusted her stirrup length, his hands brushing against her leg. Ready? They rode in silence as darkness fell, following game trails rather than the main paths. The wilderness closed around them, vast, indifferent, beautiful in its harsh way. Pearl found herself memorizing the landscape, uncertain when or if she'd see it again. The cabin appeared as a darker shape against the night sky, nestled in a stand of pines near a rocky outcropping. It was small, just one room with a stone fireplace and shuttered windows, but sturdily built. Griffin dismounted first, checking the interior before helping Pearl down from her horse. Inside, he lit a lantern, illuminating the spare furnishings, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed against one wall, a cupboard for supplies, and a wood stove. It's not much, Griffin said, but it's defendable. Only one approach, and good sight lines. Pearl sank onto one of the chairs, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. I'm sorry, she whispered. I've brought danger to your home. Griffin knelt before her, his expression earnest. You have nothing to apologize for, he said firmly. None of this is your fault. But you could have been killed today, Pearl insisted. If Mercer had decided to push. I can handle men like Mercer, Griffin replied, a hardness entering his voice that Pearl hadn't heard before. I've faced worse. In the lantern light, with shadows playing across his features, Pearl could see traces of the soldier he'd once been. The revelation both comforted and concerned her. Still, she said softly, you shouldn't have to fight my battles. Griffin's hand found hers, his touch sending warmth through her despite the gravity of their situation. Some battles are worth fighting, Pearl. Their eyes held, and the small cabin suddenly seemed to shrink around them. Pearl was acutely aware of their solitude, of the single bed, of the way Griffin's thumb unconsciously traced circles on the back of her hand. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility, until Griffin gently released her hand and stood. You should rest, he said, his voice rougher than usual. I'll take first watch. There's only one bed, Pearl pointed out. I'll manage, Griffin replied, moving to unpack their provisions. Been sleeping on the ground since I was 18. Pearl wanted to argue, to insist they could share the small space, but something in Griffin's deliberately casual manner stopped her. He was maintaining boundaries, keeping a respectful distance despite their isolated circumstances. It was both frustrating and endearing. As she prepared for bed, Pearl watched Griffin check his rifle, his movements precise and practiced. What will happen if they come? She asked quietly. Griffin didn't look up from his task. Best not to borrow trouble, he replied. Try to sleep, Pearl. Tomorrow's soon enough to worry. But sleep proved elusive. Pearl lay on the narrow bed, listening to Griffin moving quietly around the cabin, then settling into a chair positioned by the window. Outside, an owl called, its mournful cry echoing through the night. She thought about how quickly life could change, how she'd gone from daughter to fugitive to ranch cook to whatever she was now, a woman in hiding. A woman in love with a man who treated her with unfailing respect but kept his own feelings carefully guarded. Griffin, she whispered into the darkness. His response came immediately, letting her know he was still awake. Thank you for not sending me away. A pause, then his low reply. Never crossed my mind to do so. Those simple words comforted Pearl more than elaborate promises could have, and she finally drifted into sleep with the knowledge that, whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone. Morning brought fog rolling through the pines, obscuring the landscape and lending an otherworldly quality to their surroundings. Pearl awoke to find Griffin still at his post by the window, his expression alert despite his night-long vigil. You didn't wake me for my turn at watch, she accused gently. Griffin's smile was tired but genuine. Figured one of us should be well rested. Pearl insisted he rest while she prepared breakfast from their provisions. As she worked, she found herself studying the cabin more carefully. Though sparse, it showed signs of Griffin's practicality, the splitting maul positioned precisely by the woodpile, the shelf of preserved foods, the extra blankets stored in a cedar chest. You come here often? She asked when Griffin emerged from a brief but deep sleep. He stretched, his movements stiff from the uncomfortable chair. Winter mainly, when we're checking the northern fence line or hunting. Carlos and I built it 6 years back, after nearly freezing during a sudden blizzard. It's nice, Pearl said, and meant it. There was something appealing about the cabin's simplicity, its purpose. Griffin raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. It's basic. Sometimes basic is enough, Pearl replied, setting a plate before him. They spent the day in a strange domesticity, taking turns watching the trail while attending to necessary tasks. Griffin chopped wood and checked their perimeter. Pearl organized their supplies and mended a tear in Griffin's shirt. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable, punctuated by the sounds of the forest and distant cattle. As evening approached, Griffin grew restless. Tomas should have been here by now with news from town, he said, scanning the horizon for the 100th time. Pearl's stomach knotted with anxiety. Do you think something's happened? Likely just being cautious, Griffin replied, but his frown betrayed his concern. If he hasn't arrived by morning, I'll need to go check. The prospect of Griffin leaving, even temporarily, filled Pearl with dread. Is that safe? Safer than sitting here blind, he said. We need information. The evening stretched long before them. They ate a simple dinner, played cards by lantern light, and finally ran out of distractions. With night fully descended and still no sign of Tomas, the tension in the cabin grew palpable. Tell me about your father, Griffin said suddenly, breaking a long silence. Surprised by the request, Pearl gathered her thoughts. He was a gentle man, she began. A teacher back east before my mother's health forced them west. He loved books, ideas. Wasn't really suited for frontier life, but he tried his best after mother died. Sounds like a good man, Griffin observed. Pearl nodded, throat tight with emotion. He taught me to read, to think for myself. Always said education was the one thing no one could take from you. She swallowed hard. What about your parents? Griffin's expression softened in the lamplight. Father was a blacksmith in Missouri. Practical man, good with his hands. Mother was the dreamer, always had her nose in a book. Bit like your father, I suppose. And they're both gone. Pearl asked gently. Father died when I was 16. Heart gave out mid-stride. Mother hung on until after the war, but she was never the same after I enlisted. Worry aged her. The war. Pearl had wondered about Griffin's experiences, but hesitated to ask directly. Was it very terrible? She ventured. Griffin was silent for so long that Pearl thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if coming from years away. There are no words for what it was, he said. Men talk about glory, about honor. There was none of that where I was. Just mud and blood and dying boys calling for their mothers. Pearl reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. I'm sorry, she said simply. Griffin turned his hand over, his fingers interlacing with hers. After, I couldn't go home. Everything looked the same, but nothing was. So I kept moving west until I ran out of places to run. Ended up here. And found your place, Pearl said. His eyes met hers, something vulnerable in their depths. Found a purpose, at least. The ranch. Then Carlos and his family. A community. And now? Pearl asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Griffin's thumb traced the delicate bones of her wrist. Now I'm not sure what I've found, he admitted. But I know I don't want to lose it. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings. Pearl was acutely aware of Griffin's hand holding hers, of his gaze that had dropped to her lips, of her own shallow breathing. A twig snapped outside. Griffin was on his feet in an instant, extinguishing the lamp and reaching for his rifle in one fluid movement. He positioned himself by the window, signaling for Pearl to stay down. Could be Tomas, he whispered. Or an animal, Pearl suggested hopefully. Another snap, followed by the unmistakable creak of a saddle. Multiple riders, moving with deliberate stealth. It's them, Griffin breathed. Back of the cabin now. Pearl's heart pounded as Griffin guided her to a trapdoor concealed beneath a rug, a root cellar. Narrow but deep. Get in, he urged. Stay quiet, no matter what happens. I'm not hiding while you face them alone, Pearl protested. Griffin's expression was fierce in the darkness. Yes, you are, he insisted. I can't protect you if I'm worrying about your safety every second. Before she could argue further, a voice called from outside. Easton, we know you're in there. And we know the Goodwin girl is with you. Mercer. Pearl's blood ran cold. You've got one chance, the outlaw continued. Send her out, and maybe we don't burn your precious cabin to the ground with you in it. Griffin's jaw tightened. Get in the cellar, he repeated. Please, Pearl. The desperation in his voice convinced her. With a nod, Pearl descended the narrow ladder into the earthen cellar. Griffin closed the trapdoor above her, plunging her into total darkness. Muffled voices reached her, Griffin's deep tones responding to Mercer's threats. Pearl strained to hear the exchange, but could make out only fragments. Something about proof, about witnesses. Mercer's voice rising in anger. Then a gunshot shattered the night, followed by another and another. Pearl clapped her hands over her mouth to stifle her scream. More shots, the sound of breaking glass, men shouting. A crash, as if furniture had overturned. Heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Pearl fumbled in the darkness until her fingers closed around a rusted shovel. It was a pitiful weapon, but better than nothing. She positioned herself beneath the trapdoor, ready to emerge if Griffin needed her. The gunfire ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. Footsteps moved across the cabin floor above her, one set, heavy and deliberate. Friend or foe? Pearl gripped the shovel tighter, prepared to fight if the trapdoor opened. Pearl. Griffin's voice, strained but unmistakable. It's safe now. Relief flooded through her as the trapdoor lifted, revealing Griffin's face, dimly lit by moonlight streaming through the broken window. A dark stain spread across his left shoulder. You're hurt, Pearl gasped, scrambling up the ladder. Just grazed, Griffin replied, helping her out with his good arm. Mercer's dead. The others fled. Pearl looked around the devastated cabin, overturned furniture, broken glass, bullet holes in the walls. And on the floor near the door, Mercer's body, unnaturally still. He wanted to burn us out, Griffin explained, his breathing labored. Wasn't expecting me to be ready. I got lucky. That wasn't luck, Pearl said, guiding him to a chair. That was skill. She tore a clean strip from her petticoat and pressed it against his wound. We need to get you to a doctor. Griffin shook his head. Not yet. The others will regroup, possibly with reinforcements. We need to move. You can't ride with that shoulder, Pearl argued. Can and will, Griffin replied stubbornly. Dawn's just a couple hours away. We'll head for town safety in numbers there. As they prepared to leave, Pearl couldn't help glancing at Mercer's body. The man who had murdered her father would never harm anyone again. She should have felt triumph, or at least relief. Instead, she felt oddly hollow. Griffin seemed to read her thoughts. Killing never settles anything, he said quietly. Just creates more ghosts. Pearl nodded, understanding that he spoke from hard experience. What happens now? She asked as they mounted their horses, Griffin wincing as he settled into the saddle. Now we find the sheriff, Griffin replied. With Mercer dead and your testimony, we might finally get some action against Randall. They rode through the pre-dawn darkness, Griffin leading the way despite his injury. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when they reached the outskirts of town and nearly collided with a group of riders heading out. Griffin, Carlos's voice rang out in relief. We were coming to find you. Among the riders were Tomas, Sheriff Lewis, and several townsmen armed with rifles. Randall's men caught Tomas in town, Carlos explained quickly. Roughed him up pretty bad before he got away. We were worried they'd reached you first. They found us, Griffin confirmed grimly. Mercer's dead. The others scattered. Sheriff Lewis, a weathered man with a perpetually worried expression, rode forward. Miss Goodwin, you're the witness against Randall. Pearl straightened in her saddle. I saw him murder my father, she said clearly. And I'll testify to it. The sheriff nodded. Been waiting for a solid witness. Got a telegram yesterday from the federal marshal in Helena. They're building a case against Randall for multiple crimes across the territory. Your testimony could be what they need. Hope flickered in Pearl's chest for the first time in months. Does that mean it might truly be over? Not yet, the sheriff cautioned. But soon, God willing. Griffin's face had grown alarmingly pale, and Carlos noticed. You're bleeding, he said, alarmed. It's nothing, Griffin insisted, though he swayed slightly in his saddle. Hospital first, Carlos said firmly. Justice second. The town's small hospital occupied the back rooms of Dr. Whitaker's house. The elderly physician clucked disapprovingly as he examined Griffin's shoulder. Clean through the muscle, he announced. Missed anything vital, but you've lost blood, and there's risk of infection. Griffin submitted to treatment with poor grace, insisting he needed to ensure Pearl's safety. Only when the sheriff promised to post deputies at the hospital did he finally relent to the doctor's orders for bed rest. Pearl refused to leave his side, maintaining her vigil in a chair beside his bed. As the laudanum took effect, Griffin's stoic facade began to crack. "Thought I might lose you," he murmured, his eyes heavy-lidded but fixed on her face. Pearl took his hand, careful of the bandages. "I'm still here," she assured him. "Thanks to you." "Worth it," Griffin mumbled as sleep claimed him. "Worth everything." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. A federal marshal arrived from Helena to take Pearl's statement, promising protection until Randall could be apprehended. Griffin improved rapidly, chafing against the doctor's restrictions and insisting on returning to the ranch despite everyone's objections. "At least stay in town," Pearl pleaded as he prepared to leave. "Until they catch Randall." Griffin's expression softened as he looked at her. "I can't hide forever, Pearl. The ranch needs tending." "The ranch can wait," she insisted. "Your life can't. Come with me." "Then," Griffin said suddenly, "back to the ranch, where you belong." The words hung between them, laden with meaning beyond their surface. Pearl's heart leapt at the implication, but caution held her back. "Is it safe?" she asked. Griffin's smile was grim. "With a federal marshal and half the county looking for Randall?" "Safer than it's been since you arrived." That evening found them back at the ranch house, which seemed oddly unchanged despite all that had transpired. Mrs. Wilkerson had kept things in order during their absence, and the familiar routine of ranch life resumed with surprising ease. Yet something had shifted between Pearl and Griffin. Their shared danger, the confessions in the cabin, Griffin's injury all had stripped away the careful distance they'd maintained. They moved around each other with new awareness, their casual touches lingering, their gazes holding longer. A week after their return, news arrived that changed everything. Randall and the remainder of his gang had been cornered by a posse near the Idaho border. In the ensuing shootout, Randall and 2 of his men were killed. The rest were in custody, awaiting trial. "It's over," Griffin said as they stood on the porch, the telegram from the marshal in his hand. "You're free, Pearl. Truly free." The words should have brought only joy, but Pearl felt a sudden hollowness. Free meant choices. Free meant decisions about her future, a future that had seemed on hold for months. "What will you do now?" Griffin asked, his voice carefully neutral. Pearl looked out at the ranch, the pastures where cattle grazed, the barn where she'd first taken shelter, the garden she'd expanded over the summer. This place that had become home. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't thought beyond survival for so long." Griffin nodded, his expression unreadable. "You have options now. Could go back east, maybe. Start fresh somewhere." The thought of leaving sent a physical pain through Pearl's chest. "Is that what you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For me to leave?" Griffin turned to her then, the setting sun casting his features in gold and shadow. "You know it isn't," he said roughly. Pearl's breath caught. "Then what do you want, Griffin?" He moved closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek with exquisite gentleness. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as my cook, not out of necessity or fear, but because you choose to. Because this is where you belong." "With you?" Pearl whispered, her heart pounding. Griffin's eyes darkened. "With me," he confirmed. "If that's what you want." In answer, Pearl rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Griffin's arms encircled her, drawing her against him as if she were precious beyond measure. When they finally parted, both breathless, Griffin rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Pearl Goodwin," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Have since I found you weeping in my barn." Pearl's smile was radiant despite the tears that sprang to her eyes. "Is that why you gave me your hat? Marked me as yours from the beginning?" Griffin's laugh was warm against her skin. "Wasn't quite that calculated," he admitted. "But I knew, even then, that I'd do anything to keep you safe. To see you smile again." "I love you too," Pearl whispered. "And I want to stay here, with you." The kiss that followed sealed their declaration, a promise of the life they would build together. 3 weeks later, Pearl stood in the town's small church, wearing a simple white dress that Maria had helped her make. Griffin waited at the altar, looking uncomfortable but handsome in a new suit, Carlos beaming beside him as best man. As Pearl walked toward her future husband, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, the terrible loss, the desperate flight, the chance encounter that had changed everything. From a barefoot, weeping girl in a barn to a bride walking confidently toward the man she loved. When Griffin took her hand, his green eyes full of love and promise, Pearl knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world. "Ready?" he whispered as the minister prepared to begin. Pearl squeezed his hand. "Ready," she replied. "For everything." Autumn painted the Montana landscape in golds and crimsons as Pearl Easton stood on the porch of her home, watching her husband return from checking the southern pasture. 2 months of marriage had brought a contentment she hadn't thought possible after the tragedies that had marked her earlier life. Griffin dismounted with easy grace, his smile warming as he spotted her waiting. Even now, the sight of him made her heart beat faster. This strong, quiet man who had saved her in more ways than he knew. "Beautiful evening," Griffin commented as he joined her on the porch, his arms slipping naturally around her waist. Pearl leaned into him, savoring his solid presence. "Perfect for an announcement," she said, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. Griffin raised an eyebrow. "An announcement?" Taking a deep breath, Pearl placed his hand against her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby," she said softly. "Next spring." Griffin went utterly still, his expression one of stunned wonder. Then, with a whoop that startled the horses in the corral, he lifted Pearl off her feet and spun her in a circle. "Careful," she laughed, clinging to his shoulders. "Precious cargo." Griffin set her gently on her feet, his hands framing her face with reverence. "A baby," he repeated, awe in his voice. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Pearl asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Griffin replied, pulling her close again. "I never thought I'd have this, a wife, a child, a family of my own." As twilight deepened around them, they stood together on the porch of the home they shared, looking out at the land they tended, planning the future they would build. And Pearl thought of the long, strange journey that had brought her here barefoot and weeping in a barn, a stranger's hat on her head, and words that had changed her life forever. "Mine now." She hadn't known then how true those words would become, that she would be his, and he would be hers, bound together by choice and love and the promise of new life. Griffin's arms tightened around her as if he could read her thoughts. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. Pearl turned in his embrace, rising on her toes to kiss him with all the love in her heart. "Not a single one," she assured him. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." As stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Griffin and Pearl Easton entered their home together, closing the door on the past and stepping forward into the future they had found. Against all odds, a future built on courage, sacrifice, and a love that had begun with tears in a barn and a cowboy's hat, but would endure through all the seasons of their lives.